Okay, everyone. I think it's time to say welcome to Polyteknisk Förening. I'm the chairman of the IT group, and this is our big event of the year. I'd like to say a couple of introductory words. First, I will encourage you to become members of the Polytechnic Society of Norway. It is the oldest association of its kind in the world. It's non-partisan, non-politics, interested in technology and societal questions. Secondly, for those of you who wonder where you are, this is a former Sea Officer Academy, which the Norwegian School of Management took over about 15 years ago, I think. And it's been going downhill ever since. We'll be moving out of here in a few months to Dole. And no, I don't have any clue as to what will happen to this building then. Let's see. Administrative announcement. The toilets are 1 floor up.
2 floors.
2 floors for the men, 1 floor for the women. Don't use the one downstairs. I've been told they are not in a presentable condition. Okay, with that, I would like to introduce our speaker of the day. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the meetings in the Polytechnic Society, the rule is we'll give the speaker the time he needs. I think an hour should suffice. And then there's time for questions. Do you take questions as you go, if you want?
If you'd like to, but I wouldn't mind running through the whole thing too.
Okay.
It's a broad-ranging talk, so the chances are your question will be answered before it's done.
Okay. So we will hold the questions until the end. At the request of Cory, I have instituted a protocol, which is that my former student Emel, sitting down there, whose English is excellent, but who has volunteered to represent those who do not speak English very well. And she will introduce an ACK procedure, which is whenever you speak too fast, she will fan herself with an easily visible piece of paper.
Am I speaking too fast now?
So let me introduce the speaker of the day. Cory Doctorow is a science fiction author, an internet activist in questions of intellectual property, of copyright. He is one of the writers of boingboing.net, one of the most widely read blogs on the net, if not the most widely non-political blog on the net. Ike and I got interested in getting him here when we had read a speech he did at Microsoft Research, which is one of the most widely cited pure text files on the internet, and shows a breadth of interest and an ability to express many interesting viewpoints. I've challenged Cory to talk about the economics of openness, to lift the discussion of copyright and technology up from the day-to-day concerns that are very much on some people's mind here in Norway right now, and to take a slightly longer perspective. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from him. So, Cory, please.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Cory Doctorow. I work for Electronic Frontier Foundation. With your kind indulgence, I'll open up a little with some history of EFF because I think it informs tonight's topic. So Electronic Frontier Foundation was founded about 15 years ago at a time when the United States Secret Service broke into the offices of a game publisher that was making a game about cybercrime, about cyberpunks, based on the novels of William Gibson and other science fiction authors, under the mistaken impression that this was a manual for committing cybercrimes. And they confiscated all of their computers, they confiscated all of their information, and they started to introduce evidence in the trial. Now, one of the things that they wanted to show was that even if the game wasn't a manual for cybercrime, that at least the people involved in it were cyber criminals. And so to aid them in asserting this claim, they wanted to go through the email that had been left behind by Steve Jackson Games' customers on their bulletin board system. And so they took the email from the bulletin board system, the private email, and they brought it to Cory. And EFF was formed more or less at that moment by some philanthropists who wanted to fund some lawyers to show up and say, wait a second, you don't have a search warrant that lets you wiretap email. You got a search warrant that lets you look for incriminating evidence, but wiretapping email, where's your wiretap warrant? Where's the warrant that lets you invade the privacy of all those people whose communications had merely passed through the offices of the premises that you were searching? And the police at the time said, well, you've got the wrong metaphor. Email's not like a phone call. Email's not like a letter. Email's like a conversation in a bar. If you have a conversation in a bar and there's a copper standing nearby and he overhears what you're saying, well then, you're a fool to have said it in front of a copper. You have no expectation of privacy. Away you go. And EFF argued no. Clearly, email is not a conversation in a bar. It's probably also not a conversation over the phone or a conversation by postal mail. But if you have to ask us which one is it more like, what metaphor will serve society best if applied to email? The one that serves society best is the one that says that email is like our most private form of communication and not like our least. And we won that. And it set the first laws in place, and the first precedents in place that said that your email is a private communication and people who want to wiretap it need to show evidence, that there's due process for the internet. And that was the basis for all the laws, the rules and rulings that came thereafter. Everyone looked to that to find out what was going on. A few years later, we legalized crypto. Crypto is the technology that's used to scramble messages, either in transit or after they've been received. The recent history of crypto revolves around World War II, and where it suddenly became very necessary to encipher messages, to scramble them, because it was no longer possible to keep the message's existence a secret. When we moved from having messengers who would carry messages in hidden pouches, or swallow them and spit them up again when the moment came, to sending our messages by radio waves that could be intercepted by the enemy, and so you could reliably assume that your enemy had possession of your message, it suddenly became important to disguise the content of the message, even from someone who had it. And crypto science moved on and on. It's a very good, crunchy subject for mathematicians to sink their teeth into, and they got better and better at it. And along the way, the National Security Agency decided that crypto was a munition, and that exporting crypto was exporting munitions, and making crypto available was making munitions available. And we tried all kinds of different arguments to show that crypto should be legal. We tried the economic argument. We said, well, they have better ideas about crypto than this in Europe and elsewhere, and we don't have any kind of lock in America on smart mathematicians. So if we ban crypto, other countries won't, and they'll get good crypto and we won't. Our banks will be robbed and theirs won't, and our citizens will have their credit card numbers intercepted in transit and theirs won't, and so on, and we'll become a second-rate nation, and no one cared. So we tried again. We said, well, this crypto that you want us to use, because they had a cipher that they said was pretty good. In fact, the NSA has this policy that they recruit all the PhD mathematicians graduating, all the best and the brightest, and they have like a hollow mountain full of mathematicians, right? And they said, well, our hollow mountain of mathematicians reliably inform us that this cipher, something called DES40, is strong enough to withstand 1 trillion years of brute force attack. So you guys can use that. How about that? And he said, well, it's actually not very strong. We've done our own math, and we think that we can break it. They said, what do you know? Where's your hollow mountain? So we had a guy named John Gilmore, who's the co-founder of EFF. John Gilmore is notable for being the first technical employee at Sun Microsystems, developed the Spark chip, Solaris, helped write GCC, TAR, some of the critical stuff. And basically, if you've ever installed software, chances are that software was compiled with something John wrote. And John got really rich doing this, and then he got really rich again starting a company called Cygnus and selling it to Red Hat. And he also got rich founding the first dial-up ISP and selling that off and so on. So he's gotten rich a bunch of times. And he's smart, and so he's a smart, rich brain. And so John sat down and he said, well, I've got a way that we can prove that this crypto is no good. So he designed a chip that would crack DES40 in like 2 hours. And then he, made a die for it, and then he wrote an operating system for it and built a computer around it. We brought it to court and we said, Your Honor, I give you the hollow mountain. And nobody cared. So then we fell back on a real fundamental. We fell back on the Constitution of the United States, which says that the government isn't allowed to control speech. And we had a mathematician named Bernstein, who was at Princeton, and he wanted to write a book about the math of crypto. And in that book, there was source code. And that source code, if keyed into a computer, would create a cipher that was stronger than DES40. And we said, are you going to tell us that this book is a munition and that the government wants to regulate the publishing of printed words? And the court at that moment had like a moment of Zen enlightenment. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal said, you're absolutely right. This isn't the kind of thing that we should be regulating. And again, we won an important victory that safeguarded much that was to come on the internet. Recently, we defeated part of the Patriot Act. This is the act that George Bush brought in after September 11th. It was I can't remember if it was 400 or 600 page bill that apparently was written in a week. Although everyone believes that it was probably in a drawer for several years, waiting for the right opportunity. It was redrafted substantially the night before the vote. None of the people who voted on it read the redraft. It was unanimously passed with one abstention. And it contains all kinds of nasty surprises. Among them are the ability for police, without having any evidence, to go and use secret warrants to find out what you're reading at libraries and so on. And we defeated part of that in the Supreme Court this year with some of our allies. Friday, we defeated the broadcast flag. Thank you. I'm going to go into more stuff about the broadcast flag, and in particular about the European broadcast flag that is to come. But the broadcast flag was a rule that said if you want to build a television, you need to get a license from people who make television programs, and they need to affirm that all the things that your television will do are okay with them, right? That basically, that the limited monopoly on controlling who gets to copy my television show could be bootstrapped into an unlimited monopoly on who gets to make technology that could conceivably be used in connection with copying my television show. And we won that. We are about to win Grokster. Grokster is a case before the Supreme Court in the United States. It's a case that argues that people who make peer-to-peer software aren't liable for what their users do, any more than people who make telephones are liable for what telephone callers do, or people who make VCRs are liable for people who tape shows off the television without permission, which was a case that was fought and won in 1984 in the Supreme Court. So it's at the Supreme Court now, and we're going to win it. As you heard, I'm a science fiction writer, and I won't say much more about that except to say that my mode of production is very much related to open modes of production. I write books. They're published by Tor Books. They're a science fiction publisher in New York. They're the largest science fiction publisher in the world, and a division of Holtzbrinck. And the day that those books come out on the shops, they're released simultaneously on the internet as ASCII text files, HTML files, and PDF, under licenses that allow for the unlimited non-commercial redistribution of them, and in some cases for even reuse, so you can make your own fan translations and so on. And that's been really successful for me. I've won a bunch of awards, I've been nominated for more, and my first novel's just gone into its 5th printing. And so when I speak about peer-based commons production, I'm not whistling Dixie. I'm talking about stuff that I have personal direct experience with. So copyright, in my view, is a technology for, or as a policy rather, for regulating technology. Right? Because the things that copyright regulates, copying, distribution, those are technological activities. You can't regulate copying without regulating copying machines. And copyright pretty much dates back to the advent of copying machines, to things like printing presses, and then later on to phonograms, and then later on revised for radio, and then later on revised for VCRs and so on. Tim Wu is a Canadian copyright scholar who lives in the United States, and I'm going to steal a lot of this talk from him because he's really sharp, and I urge you to download his papers. He wrote a paper called Copyright's Communications Policy, in which he talks about how copyright implies a communications and competition policy. Like I said, the broadcast flag lets you bootstrap your limited monopoly over who gets to make copies of a movie into an unlimited monopoly over who gets to design technology that can be used in connection with movies. So one of the best examples we have of this was the advent of the piano roll in America, which was the first technology that could be used to copy a performance of a song. So up until then, all the technology that was used in connection with music was technology for copying compositions of songs. You would lay a composition out in hot lead, and you'd press it, and then you'd sell the pressings to people who would then invite talented pianists to come over to their homes and play the songs that they bought as sheet music. And the composers, as a result, had a really good business. They were the music industry. The composers and their publishers were the music industry. And as far as they were concerned, they were it. Performers weren't all that important to the music industry at the time, because a performance was really, after all, just following directions. Right? A performer was a trained monkey. Right? You handed her or him a sheet of instructions, right? The John Philip Sousa composition, and the performer would translate those instructions into a set of music. But the idea of a famous performer was like the idea of a famous piano. And it didn't make any sense. So then we started to get the ability to copy performances. Right? First with piano rolls, and then later on with phonograms that were talking machines that would record actual performances. And all of a sudden, performers became famous, and they did so on the backs of composers. Because with piano rolls, the way that it would work is the piano roll publisher would go out and he'd buy some sheet music, one copy of a sheet music, and then he'd rip it to a digital format, right? A long roll of computer tape with zeros and ones, voids and not voids, holes and not holes, that could then be fed back into a specialized device that would render that back into a performance. And later on, you actually got performers who would go and record a performance that they bought on sheet music and then record on disc or on wax cylinder or twists of bent wire and sell them on without compensating the composers at all. And John Philip Sousa, who was the leading American composer of the day, went to Congress and he said, if these infernal talking machines are allowed to continue, we will not have a voice box left in America. Our vocal cords will fall out as our tails fell away from us when we came down out of the trees and ceased to be monkeys. John Philip Sousa made the category error that everyone makes when a new technology comes along. He thought that his little music industry was every possible music industry. Now the answer to that was really interesting. The answer to that was that Congress said, we are not going to give you the right to control devices that can be used to copy performances of your composition. That would be nuts, because you guys have got really bad ideas. Like, you think that these technologies should be illegal for starters. And then you think the ones that should be legal should be broken in some way. They should be worse at reproducing performances. Maybe they should cost a little money every time you play a performance. Well, that's not what these machines are for. These machines are for playing performances. What you're describing is a machine for not playing performances. So instead what they said is anyone who gets a composition, who gets hold of a composition, can record as many versions of that composition as they want, provided that they compensate the composer at the rate of 2 cents per copy. The composer can't say no. When Sid Vicious went out and recorded My Way, Anka didn't get to say no. The Sex Pistols were allowed to cover his songs, because the compulsory license allows anyone to do it provided that they compensate an artist. Not long thereafter, the performers found themselves facing down radio. And they said, my goodness, how are we ever going to make radio a viable business for us? After all, we make our living either by selling phonograms or by charging admission to a hall like this. And we have a business model. And that business model is that if you want to hear us perform, you have to pay a guy who's standing at the door. And if you don't pay him, he'll throw you out. Right? And you want to replace that with a system where anyone who can build or acquire a crystal set can hear our recordings without paying us. Can't you design a radio that we can charge admission to? Can't you design a radio that's worse at transmitting performances? And the answer again was no. The answer was, instead, we're going to give you the opportunity to receive some compensation from radio play by setting up a collecting society that everyone who wants to play records over the radio pays some money into. And we're going to invent a new form of math for statistically sampling who's listening without having any actual way of accounting for it. And then we're going to pay out some money to the artists based on this. And they created 1,000 times more art and 1,000 times more money for 1,000 times more artists that reached an audience of 1,000 times. At the time, the composers and the performers were livid. They said, especially the performers, they said, well, we are charismatics. right? We stand on a stage like this one, and we perform for an audience. And when we perform for that audience, we do something holy. We do something that dates back to the first storyteller who stood around the first fire in the first cave and entertained an audience. And when you say that you're going to disintermediate that and render us mere clerks, relegated to a back room where we record our performances in a studio as though we were nothing but accountants, and then you go out and you sell our product, well, how dare you? Now, I mention this because today, when one of the models that's often proffered for open business in the music industry is bandied about with them, and when we say to them, well, look, you know, the 70 or 80 year period during which it was possible to compel money for a recording of a performance has sunset, you're just going to have to give live performances because you can put a man on the door with his arms folded, and if someone tries to come in without paying $1, he can throw them out. They say, well, how dare you? We aren't trained monkeys. We're white-collar workers. We work in our studios where we commune with our muse. And if you tell us that we must engage in this means of production that you've conceived of as the only way that we can make music, well, you'll doom all those artists who only perform well in the studios, but are no charismatics to the breadline, the London driving taxis. Well, the fact is that technology giveth and technology taketh away. So not long thereafter, we had several other technologies appear. We had the jukebox, which was illegal until it was legalized through a compulsory license. We had cable television. The broadcasters didn't want cable TV because they thought it was going to undermine the market for broadcast. It would Napsterize them. And so the cable casters did what any self-respecting entrepreneur did. They stole the broadcast signals. And the way that they did it was they put an antenna up, and they received as many broadcasting signals as they could, and they put them back out over the wire, and they sold them. And Congress's response was, we're not going to let broadcasters, by dint of being the broadcasters, control all possible technologies for transmitting television shows. So instead, we will compel you to sell your product at a fixed rate. The VCR, from 1976 to 1984, fought a long battle in the American Congress and courts that culminated with the courts saying the VCR is just legal. Not only is it legal, but it's legal even without any kind of levy or payment. We believe that you'll go on making movies, even if we don't charge people who record movies off of the television a little bit of money for the privilege in the form of a levy on tapes and VCRs. Now, in other countries, they chose differently. In other countries, probably Norway, I assume it's true here in Norway, they charge a levy either on the blank media or the devices or both. It's interesting to note that the country that has no levies on these also has the most profitable film industry, and they certainly haven't stopped making movies as a result of the VCR, even though at the time they said they would. Jack Valenti, the mouthpiece for the Motion Picture Association of America, had a moment where he was possessed by the spirit of John Philip Sousa. And he went to the Congress in 1982, and he said, if the VCR is to the American film industry as the Boston Strangler is to a woman home alone, right? Famous serial killer of the day. Most recently, we had the broadcast flag. The broadcast flag was, as I said, a rule that was promulgated by the motion picture studios. And they said that what we want is a world in which anyone who wishes to make a device that's capable of receiving a digital television broadcast will be required to come to a regulator and assure the regulator that none of the features in that, none of the outputs or recording methods, could be used in a way that's disruptive to our business. Andy Sitos, who's the president of Fox, who's responsible for technology and who wrote the broadcast flag, told me at one of the early meetings of the Broadcast Protection Discussion Group where this was drafted, he said, look, all we're after here is a polite marketplace. All we're looking for is a place where, before you disrupt my business, you give me ample notice, a chance to respond, and if I can't figure out how to save my business, you step away from it. Well, we have a name for that. It's a fairly discredited one, but we call it a planned economy usually, or when we're feeling a little less charitable, we call it Stalinism, right? That's it's not much of a business for a billion-dollar company that's traded on the public markets to be getting into. To understand what happens when you give a studio or a rights holder a veto over technology, you need look no farther than the DVD and the CD. These are basically the same technology, a couple of silver discs. They're pressed usually in the same plants using very similar processes. These days they're even read in the same device with the same laser. If you bought 10,000 kroners worth of CDs 10 years ago, 10 years later, you have the ability to use them for karaoke, mash them up, turn them into MP3s, put them on your iPod, put them on MP3 CDs that hold 10 times more music, turn them into ringtones, use them for your alarm clock, share them with a friend, excerpt them, library them, format shift them, back them up. If you bought 10,000 kroners worth of DVDs 10 years ago, all you're legally allowed to do with them 10 years later is watch them. In 10 years, not one new substantial feature has come to the DVD. Your investment in DVDs is rotting on the shelf, while your investment in CDs is skyrocketing. So Tim Wu also talks about how copyright implies an authorship policy in a paper called Copyright's Authorship Policy. Depending on what is and what isn't legal, different forms of authorship end up being legalized and privileged. So it was legal for Walt Disney to take a movie called Steamboat Bill, starring Buster Keaton, and turn it into a cartoon called Steamboat Willie, starring Mickey Mouse, without permission. It was legal for Walt Disney to take old German folk stories that had been recorded by the Brothers Grimm, like Snow White, and turn them into movies like Snow White. It was legal for the Beatles to go and take a whole bunch of found samples of calliope music, old steam organ music, and cut it up and turn it around and mix it up and make it into that weird swirling chorus in Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was legal for Two Live Crew to sample Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman because a court found that they were making a parody. It was legal to make a play of Huckleberry Finn the year that it was written without giving Mark Twain a penny and without asking his permission, because at the time copyright law didn't cover adaptations. So you were allowed to make an adaptation without permission of the rights holder. It is legal today in America to make a Braille edition of Stephen King without Stephen King's permission and distribute it to blind people. It is legal today in London to take a photo of the London Eye, that giant Ferris wheel on the South Bank, and make an art litho of it and sell it for money. However, it is not legal to take a photo of the Eiffel Tower and sell art lithos of it for money. Because apparently, if it were legal, we'd get fewer Eiffel Towers. It was illegal for DJ Danger Mouse to take the Beatles' White Album and Jay-Z's Black Album and put them together in an album that music critics all over the world hailed as one of the most wildly innovative new records of the decade, that he called the Grey Album. Because presumably, if he were allowed to do so, the Beatles would record fewer albums. It is illegal for Chinese authors who grow tired of waiting for J.K. Rowling to get over her writer's block and write the next Harry Potter book to write their own sequel called Harry Potter and Harry Potter Carry Tiger to Mountain, I think is what it was called. It was illegal for them to do that because presumably this will convince J.K. Rowling to write fewer novels. It is illegal to make free software that is used in connection with digital television under the rules proposed for the broadcast flag. So what they said under the rules of the broadcast flag, in addition to a requirement that you get permission from the studios for any technology you wanted to add to a digital television, they also required that whatever you do had to be designed so that end users couldn't modify it. Because obviously, if they're going to set out the number of features that you're allowed to have and what their characteristics are, it won't do to sell it to you and have you bring it home and pull out your pliers or your computer and change what those characteristics are. And would defeat the whole purpose. So as a result, anyone who wants to make technology components used in connection with digital television that are open, that can be modified by end users, that are licensed under free software and open source licenses, is out of luck. In fact, they're breaking the law. Because presumably if they didn't, we'd get fewer TV broadcasts. It's illegal in many countries in Europe to do a traditional copyleft license like the GPL or the Creative Commons licenses. These are licenses in which you say, I give up some of my copyright in this work and promise not to sue you if you want to use it to make your own work. That's the license that I use on my books. That's the license that was used to make the GNU Linux operating system. It's the license for the Apache web server, which is the most popular web server in the world, and for the most popular mail servers in the world, and so on. Those are illegal in many European countries because in many European countries you can't waive your right to sue under something called strong moral rights, where in perpetuity an author retains the inalienable right to sue any subsequent user of the work for bringing his name into disrepute for using the work in a way that is insulting to his reputation. So an example of this from Toronto, where I come from in Canada, where we also have moderately strong moral rights, is there was a sculptor named Michael Snow who carved some Canada geese, which is kind of our national bird. And they hung them, they were commissioned from the largest shopping mall in Toronto. And they hung them down the atrium of the shopping mall. And then one year at Christmas, the shopping mall put red ribbons around the geese's neck. And Michael Snow said, "How dare you, you've commercialized my mall geese." And he was able to force them to remove the ribbons. So imagine that you have a piece of software like the Mozilla browser or the GNU Linux operating system that has thousands of contributors, and any one of them has the perpetual non-waivable right to force you to stop using it in some way. And they're not allowed to waive it. They can't write down on a bit of paper, "I promise not to see you." It won't hold. Right? So different kinds of copyright make different kinds of authorship possible. Depending on what kind of copyright you have, you do or you don't end up privileging one form or another. Now, the objective of copyright should be to be neutral on authorship, neutral on competition, neutral on communications, to give equal weight to all forms of artistic production, all forms of art, all forms of corporation that's used to commission or arrange for, produce, or sell art. They should all be equally valid under a copyright system, because it shouldn't be the job of a regulator to sit down and figure out what kind of art should be made, but rather to see to it that artists get a fair deal, however it is they engage in making art. And copyright used to be a domestic affair so that regulators could do that, because depending on what your national circumstances are, different rules apply. If you're in a country where you have lots of large publishers that cross-license their catalogs to other large publishers, and those large publishers arrange for the majority of recordings, say, getting samples is not a big deal, right? You've got a large recording company in your country, there's a large recording company in the other country, you have a bunch of copyright lawyers, they've got a blanket deal between each other. If one of your artists wants to pull a few seconds off of one of their artist songs, you know what it costs, bingo, bango, bongo, no problem. But if you live in Ghana or Burundi or potentially Norway, I expect you don't have a lot of large music publishers that publish a lot of music for export, at least to, say, the North America, then you probably don't have the ability to do that. You probably need a different arrangement if you want to allow your artists to use samples, if you want to see to it that it's a fair shake, no matter what country you live in. In fact, the United States was probably the first and best beneficiary of this. The United States spent 100 years as the world's pirate nation. That's what they called it. They were called the pirate nation because the only copyrights, patents, and trademarks that the United States honored were ones held by American companies and American citizens. And so Charles Dickens' books were produced like mad in America without a penny going to Charles Dickens and widely circulated through the United States. Now, Charles Dickens needed to respond to this. On the one hand, he responded to it by fuming, and he was famous for fuming about the American pirate editions. The other thing he did was he adapted his mode of production. He said, all right, I'll write serials. Because serials, that is to say, books that haven't been written yet, can't be pirated. Right? There will always be a market of people standing on the docks in Boston Harbor saying, "Is Little Nell dead?" Right? Because I haven't written that bit yet. I'm publishing it in newspapers that come out every week. Right? So he adapted in the same way that the recording artists who found themselves confronted with radio either adapted or ended up driving taxis. Charles Dickens adapted and didn't end up driving a hackney cab. Now, how did the United States stop being a pirate nation? Well, it got Mark Twain. And Mark Twain's books were being wildly pirated in London. Right? And at that point, it made sense for America to start talking to Britain about what kind of copyright rules there should be between those two countries. But only then did it suit its national interests. Canada today is a great beneficiary of local norms in copyright. Canada, where I come from, we have the largest undefended border in the world. It's with the United States. 70% of our population lives within a few hours' drive of America. And if you put a broadcast antenna up, you can receive American broadcasts over the border. Now, that's great if you've got a broadcast antenna, but most people have cable. And the cable operators obviously want to get access to American programming. But what good would it do a Canadian cable operator to send money to America? So they don't. They just steal American broadcasts. It's legal in Canada to put up an antenna, not pay the American broadcaster 1 cent, gather in all the American broadcasters that are within reach of your antenna, cut out the American commercials and insert Canadian ones, and then sell the cable to Canadians. All around the world, there are countries that find themselves in the position where not honoring foreign patents on pharmaceuticals would be better domestic policy than honoring foreign patents on pharmaceuticals, because there isn't enough money in that country to buy enough AIDS drugs or malaria drugs or TB drugs for all the people who need them, even at the discounted rates, even with the donations from foreign pharma companies. And after all that money that they give to foreign pharma companies leaves their borders. So just like Canada doesn't want to send money for cable casts to the rest of the world, why should Burundi or South Africa send money for AIDS drugs to the rest of the world? Well, the reason that they do so is because we now have harmonized IP, harmonized copyright patents and trademarks around the world, mostly thanks to an agreement called the Berne Convention. That's a very old one. It dates back to the turn of the 20th century. And, or rather, hundreds of years old. I can't remember if it's the 20th or 19th. It's just gone straight out of my head.
1896.
1896, thank you. Turn of the 19th century then. We have the WTO and TRIPS, which kind of cemented this. So the World Trade Organization promulgated TRIPS, which is the IP agreement that's part of the trade agreement. And what it does is it ties your copyright, patent, and trademark policy to your ability to export things like soybeans, steel, and petroleum. So if why would Canada adopt a rule about forcing Canadian cablecasters to pay money to American broadcasters? Well, possibly because if they don't, America won't accept Canadian steel anymore. And at that point, it starts to become a really big deal. And so you started to see countries all around the world going from having domestically appropriate IP policies to having harmonized, generic, one-size-fits-all IP policies. And probably the single largest cause of all of this is an organization in Geneva called WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, or OMPI in French. And WIPO is essentially a trade association pretending to be a United Nations agency. In fact, all it was a trade association until 25, 30 years ago, at which point it was brought into the UN and legitimized as a UN agency on the grounds that it was going to create a series of policies that would treat IP as a tool for achieving humanitarian goals, development, creativity, and so on. WIPO has never actually written a treaty where they have given any consideration to these, as near as any of us can tell. But that's what they've been doing for the last 25, 30 years. So in 1996, WIPO wrote two very important treaties called the WCT and WPPT. These were their internet treaties. And these were brought into Europe as the EUCD, and they're about to be implemented here in Norway. They were brought into America as the DMCA, and they're about to be implemented in Canada as Canada's Omnibus Copyright Reform Bill. The idea of the WIPO treaties was to see to it that the internet acted as much like the technologies that preceded it as was possible. So the first idea was to ensure that anyone who was a major rights holder would be able to expand their limited monopoly over copying their works into an unlimited monopoly over all technologies for copying all works. And that was accomplished through something called anti-circumvention. And the second objective was to preserve all existing modes of authorship at the expense of new ones. So let's talk about anti-circumvention. Anti-circumvention, of course, is a topic of national interest in this country. It says that anyone who tells someone how to break a lock off a software product breaks the law. Anyone who breaks a lock off a software product breaks the law. Anyone who tells someone whom they should ask to find out how to break a lock off a copyrighted work breaks the law. A knowledge good breaks the law. It is useless at preventing copying for technical reasons. The technical reason being that when you give the attacker the keys, right, when you give me, whom you expect not to break the DRM, the keys to the DRM so that I can watch the movie, then at a certain point I will figure out how to get those keys that you've given me and unlock the DRM. All DRM is broken within weeks, sometimes months, rarely years, never very much longer than that, and practically every work that's ever been restricted with a DRM system can be downloaded for free without DRM from the internet right now. So DRM is a complete failure as a system at stopping people from making unrestricted, indiscriminate copies. So what's DRM good for? What DRM is really good for is protecting industries from competition. Like with DVDs and CDs. If you want to make sure that you never have to reinvent your business to accommodate the fact that people have invented all the things that CDs do, but brought them over to the DVD world, then you can put DRM on your DVD. And anyone who breaks the lock off the DVD breaks the law. So no one can go into business figuring out how to let you move the movies from your DVD onto your mobile phone, the same way that you can move the songs from your CDs onto your mobile phone. It's just against the rules. You never have to figure out how to do it. You just have to, once you have a good idea, you can license someone to do it, but no one else gets to do it until you get there. It's Antecedents' polite marketplace. Kaleidoscape is a company that actually took a license to make a DVD player. And they read that license really carefully, and what they thought it said was that they could make a DVD player that would rip the DVDs to a big hard drive that they could then sit in your basement or in your living room, and you could watch all of your DVDs from a menu off your screen. You wouldn't have to load and unload discs. You could put all the discs in storage in your basement or in your attic and never have to look at the discs again. The same way today we carry around thousands of CDs on an iPod or a similar device. And they thought that it would let them do this provided that they made the hard drive system at least as restrictive as a DVD. And whether or not it did, the response of the industry was, how dare you? We're suing you for doing this. We believe that you violated the license. Even if you haven't, we'll change the license so that you are, because this is not a feature that we're ready to have in the market yet. We haven't figured out how to make it safe for us, which is to say, we haven't figured out how to make this business model work for us, so why should you be able to bring it to market? Apple makes the Apple iPod and the Apple iTunes Music Store. These are not particularly effective DRMs in these technologies. They're routinely broken, obviously. They're broken within days of being patched, they're rebroken. Every song that's available in the iTunes Music Store is available for download on the peer-to-peer networks. The Big Champagne, who monitor peer-to-peer networks, tell us that the songs that are released Apple Store only, so the only copies in the world, are DRM'd, show up on Kazaa 4 minutes after they're released on the Apple Store. No Apple customer buys Apple Music because of the DRM. No one walked into a store this morning and said, I wish there was a way I could do less with my music. What can you sell me? So why does Apple have DRM? Well, Apple has DRM because when Real, a competitor of Apple's, decided to release some new software for the iPod that would let you play real music on your iPod, Apple was able to threaten to sue them until they backed off. Right? So what Apple was able to do was not control copying, because copying is happening without limit, but to completely limit competition. So what's the collateral damage of this? You know, is this just a competition question, or does this cause other fallout? Well, it bans math is the real problem with it. You get people who basically invent math that describes ways of getting around these restrictions in the same way Bernstein invented math that describes ciphers that were stronger than the ones that the NSA wanted. And they publish these in the form of software, or in the form of books, or in the form of articles. And then they get threatened with lawsuits, or sometimes they even go to jail. Here, of course, you have Jan Lech Johansson, who spent his adolescence going through the courts because he dared to publish some math. You have, in the United States, Ed Felton, who's an Ivy League engineering professor, who proposed to present at a learned conference on signal processing some things he learned while finding the flaws in a watermarking technology brought forward by the recording industry called SDMI. And the recording industry's response was to threaten not just Ed, but to threaten the conference itself and say, if you give him a stage to stand on and a microphone to speak into, you'll be as guilty as he is, and we'll see you in court. We have Dmitry Skilyarov, it's a Russian hacker technologist who came over to a tech conference in Las Vegas, gave a presentation on how badly Adobe had screwed up in making its ebook DRM, and it really is kind of a textbook case. If you go through it, it's laughable if it wasn't sad, because really they just made every stupid possible mistake. And he told them how it works, and they put him in jail. Right? The FBI put him in jail, and when he got home, the Russian equivalent of the State Department said to its scientists, they issued a memo saying, don't go to America. They've turned into the kind of country where they put you in jail if you talk about the wrong kind of math. Right? The Russian State Department warned its scientists to stay away from America because if you violate the official science of the state, they put you in jail. Now, the other piece of fallout from criminalizing math is that the only method we have for determining whether or not a security system works is to tell people how it works and see if they can find a flaw for it. Bruce Schneier is probably one of the leading security experts in the world, has said that any person can design a security system that's so secure that he himself can't imagine a way of breaking it. I could come up with a lock that I can't figure out how to pick, right? But how do you know whether or not anyone else will figure out how to pick it? Well, what you need to do is tell everyone how your lock works. Everyone who's serious about security does this, right? They tell everyone how it works. And when someone finds a flaw, then you patch it. And you just keep doing that, right? That's why we come up with critical pieces of security infrastructure like SHA-1 hashing, and then someone finds collisions in it, and we start to look for a replacement for SHA-1 hashing. Because it's only good until someone figures out how to break it. As soon as someone figures out how to break it, you start looking for an alternative. What you don't do is keep it a secret and hope that none of the people who've broken it will tell anyone else about it. It's a fool's paradise. So the next thing that the WIPO treaties do is they establish ISP liability. It's actually a really interesting magic trick. It's one of those tricks where they go, look over here, right? What they do is they say, first of all, ISPs are liable for what their customers do. Right? If you're an ISP and someone transmits some infringing information or hosts some infringing information using your network, you're liable for it. And having gotten everyone to buy into that, no one says if you're an automobile manufacturer and someone robs a bank and drives away in your car, you're liable for it. No one says if you're a restaurateur and someone comes in and sits at your back table and plots a bank robbery, you're responsible for it. No one says if you're a mobile phone company and someone uses your phone to make a ransom call, you're responsible for it. But they start by saying ISPs are responsible for the traffic that they carry. But if you want to avoid responsibility, here's how you can do it. Right? And what they say is all you need to do to get into the safe harbor and avoid responsibility is throw away all due process and privacy for your customers. So, for example, if you want to tell someone, if you want to get something taken off of an internet server in a country that has acceded to the WIPO treaties, you need only call up the ISP and represent yourself as the legitimate representative of an aggrieved rights holder who believes that something being hosted by that ISP infringes on their copyright. And then it'll go away. Now, the ISP at their discretion can ring up the person whose material they were hosting and say, we've just taken this thing down. Do you disagree that it's infringing? If you do, we'll put it back up again. But in practice, ISPs don't do that for the most part. And the ones that do cost a lot of money because they have enormous legal staff. So I host a website called Boing Boing. Boing Boing gets about 350,000 unique visitors a day. 250 visitors, and then another 100,000 RSS readers. The average visitor comes back about 4 times a day. The RSS readers come 10, 20, 50 times a day. That's a lot of bandwidth. Now, you can get a terabit a month of bandwidth for $150 from an ISP that tells you that one complaint will result in immediate termination of your account. Right? What we pay for our ISP that has enough lawyers that they won't terminate us on one complaint is $1,500 a month. So that's the cost of telling ISPs that they're liable, and then saying that you can get out of it by taking material down without investigating the claim. Now, the Oxford Internet Institute did an amazing stunt where they took a copy of John Stuart Mill's 19th century treatise on liberty. I think it was 1876, 1886. They put it on a web server, and then they wrote a letter to the people who were hosting it, the people who ran the web server, and they said, "We are the legitimate representatives of John Stuart Mill's copyrights. We own on liberty, and we demand that you take it down," and poof, away it went. In Amsterdam, Bits of Freedom repeated this experiment. It's been done all over the world, and in general, ISPs just make this stuff disappear. Now, that's really interesting, but it doesn't actually stop much infringement. What it does do is it stops speech. So the Church of Scientology, if you criticize the Church of Scientology, chances are your ISP will get a takedown notice if you quote any of their material, because it's a cheap and easy way to make critics of the Church of Scientology go away. Diebold is a company, multinational company, that makes all kinds of machines. They make cash registers, EKGs, voting machines. Voting machines are the only kind of machine they make that doesn't leave a paper trail. All their other machines have an audit tape. And their voting machines crash in the field all the time. And a whistleblower who worked at Diebold leaked memos that said, "Our voting machines crash all the time in the field. And when they do, we log into them, and sometimes we do crazy stuff like manufacture plausible voter counts in collusion with the people who sourced the machine from us, because they don't want to get into trouble for being so stupid as to buy our product." Right? And so everyone keeps it hush, hush, hush. And Diebold and so these memos were leaked. Now, Diebold didn't say that they were wrong. They didn't say that they violated a trade secret. They said those memos were written by our employees. Their work's made for hire, and we own the copyright to them. Everyone who reposts those memos during this election year violates our copyright. And they started to send out thousands of automated takedown notices. The BBC found itself proactively moderating its message boards. Right? They were paying people to pre-moderate 1 million messages a day because they weren't sure what their liability would be. So a tax-funded organization, a public service broadcaster, instead of doing a public service, is paying people, board people to click and click again because they weren't sure what their liability would be as a carrier, and they didn't want to find out the hard way. Right? That's the fallout from this stuff. The other piece of this is that you can, so in addition to taking stuff down, you can also pierce the veil of anonymity. So you can find out who an ISP's customers are simply by turning up and presenting yourself as an aggrieved rights holder. And we see in the field this being used by stalkers, nutcases, private eyes, and so on, who routinely use this to get around the privacy of users. We also see the reporting industry sending out thousands of automated takedown notices, or automated, warrants, where they want to find out who these people are. They go on these fishing expeditions where they send out thousands and thousands of them indiscriminately, sometimes without much due care, so they end up getting the personal information of people who don't have computers, or people who've never used file sharing software, or people whose computers can't run the file sharing software they're being accused of having run, because they don't take any care. They also, in the takedown world, send notices to universities who have professors named Usher, who put up tracks of their lectures as MP3s, takedown notices on behalf of the band Usher, saying that your Professor Usher is probably this band Usher, we demand that they go away. Motion picture studios send out takedown notices to people who host versions of Linux that have the same names as movies, because they're large files that have approximately the same name as a film, and so they must be the film, and so on. Now, this doesn't prevent any infringement. If you remember Paris Hilton, her mobile phone was hacked. On that mobile phone were dirty movies she took of herself and her boyfriend having sex. And those movies spread all over the internet. And she had at her disposal notice and takedown, everything else she needed to make that file go away. That file didn't go away. There was no amount of notice and takedown that would have made that file go away. The other thing that's happened since the 1996 treaties were drafted is peer-to-peer. Now, notice and takedown may or may not work for a website, but notice and takedown has no particular value against peer-to-peer. Right? You can't order takedown of a peer. The other thing that these treaties lack, or rather have, is optional exceptions for beneficial activities. What they lack is a harmonized framework for beneficial activities. For the last 100, 200 years, we've lived in a world where we are continuously harmonizing the rights of rights holders, where the restrictions on what the public can do with the works that have been created are harmonized all around the world. But the rights of the public have never been subjected to the same kind of harmonization. So, social organizations depend on collaboration. You might have an organization in Florida that transcodes books to Braille for blind people. But that organization can't collaborate with people in South Africa, because while it's legal to do that under the American copyright law, it's illegal to do it under the South African law. There's no harmonized set of freedoms. The lack of, the moral rights, as I said, interfere with collaboration. There's no harmonized set of exceptions to moral rights that interfere with, that would allow us to do copyleft. So that in every country in the world you could say, I'm going to accede to this license because I understand that this license's purpose is to allow other people to come along and use it later, and I'll accede to it and promise that I'll never sue you for what you do with it, and I will be able to renege on that promise. I will waive even my right to renege. We don't have formalities. Right? That's one of the things that we've harmonized out of all of the copyright laws in the world. A formality is basically a registration requirement, that when you make a work, you have to go and register the work so that it's understood who it belongs to if you want to take a license for it. And only those works that people think are worth registering get copyright. And those other works that no one cares to register, no one gets a copyright in. Now that's actually worked relatively well in places that have had registration. The biggest problem with registration has been that the registration offices were big and slow and dumb. But big and slow and dumb gets replaced by the internet really fast. There was a time when book selling was big and slow and dumb. Today, pretty much every book you want to lay hands on, you can get, even if it's out of print, through smart, fast, agile, technology-based solutions to this. It used to be that public domain books were very hard to lay hands on. Project Gutenberg has made them all available. It didn't address the idea that we might need a formality, even a limited one, for things like finding out who holds the rights to a work if you want to use it further down the line in a critical work or in a documentary. Today we have millions of orphan works, works whose rights holders aren't known, and where all copies of the work will be likely to disappear before the copyright on them expires. A recent example in a set of American hearings on this was someone who was doing documentary research into the early scientific colonies on the continent of Antarctica. And he had a lot of photos of the places where the workers worked in Antarctica, the buildings and the interiors. Those photos were copyright to the photographers who took them, but no one knows who they belong to. He can't preserve them, and they will disappear. Peer-to-peer is a genuine problem. It's a genuine problem because it criminalizes the majority of internet users who are engaged in file sharing of one kind or another. It coerces universities into wiretapping their students. There are universities all across the world now that wiretap their entire networks to determine whether or not there's infringing activity going on, attempt to automatically detect and stop infringement. It erodes due process, and it fails to compensate artists. So we need to solve peer-to-peer. No amount of iTunes music stores can decriminalize users, restore due process, or compensate artists for the music that's shared outside of the iTunes music store. Collective licensing, which is the kind of licensing that was used to legalize television, jukeboxes, VCRs, cable television, and so on, can solve this problem in a way that's neutral in respect of authorship and neutral in respect of competition. If your work is on the internet and it's found, you get some money for it. If you want to share music that's on the internet, you pay some money for it. But what you don't need to do is recruit an army of lawyers to track down the far-flung descendants of every third trombonist of every symphony recorded in 1934 and find out if they're okay with Grandpa's music being shared on the internet and how much they'd like for the privilege. You recently had the Napster.no case here. That's really not the answer to peer-to-peer. Napster.no and the American equivalents, and MyMP3.com, Scour, Napster One, and so on, begat technologies like Nutella and Freenet. The recent shutdowns of BitTorrent trackers have begat anonymized, decentralized BitTorrent services. These are harder to use, they're harder to track, they're harder to deliver, they're harder to monitor for the purpose of collective licensing. These legislative actions against popular technologies are nothing more than the creation of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So how should Norway implement the EUCD and accede to the 1996 treaties? Well, in fact, you're lucky in that Canada, whose closest neighbor, has one of the oldest WIPO treaty implementations in the world, has recently started to look at what its WIPO implementation should look like. And in so doing, they've looked very closely at all the ways that the American laws that were created on the basis of those treaties have failed and failed again. And they've tried to come up with an answer that doesn't fail. Really what they're trying to do is go from beta to 1.0. And in their 1.0, they've set out all kinds of great limitations on the teeth in the EUCD, in the WIPO Copyright Treaty, in the WIPO Phonogram and Performance Treaty. And I'll go through some of those now, and I refer you to them later. You can look them up on your own. I think that anyone who's interested in the subject should be pointing your lawmakers to them. They do things like they expand the limitations on copyright and exceptions for archivists, educators, and people who provide access to disabled people. And they set out a bunch of affirmative limitations, things that you're absolutely allowed to do if you're engaged in those activities. And then what they do is they limit the anti-circumvention laws so that they only cover DRM that can only be used outside of those exceptions. So if your DRM can be used to restrict someone who wants to make a Braille transcoding of a book, then it gets no anti-circumvention protection. You're allowed to circumvent the DRM on it. You're allowed to make tools to circumvent the DRM on it, even if it's being used in connection with other tools. It puts the challenge on the people who make DRM to make DRM that respects the public's rights, instead of saying the public's rights are the collateral damage and our mission to ensure that our traditional modes of industry are preserved. So among the kinds of things that this limits are don't preclude open source. So if you have a DRM that can't be implemented in open source, it gets no anti-circumvention protection. If it can be used to protect rights other than copyright, it doesn't get anti-circumvention protection. If you buy a DVD, it has all kinds of copyrights on it that aren't actually copyrights. It has the right to control what country you watch it in. Right? There's region coding on DVDs. There's no copyright that says the person who sells you the movie gets to control what country you watch it in after you buy it. That's a copyright that they got to invent, having invented having invented the DRM that sits on top of it. And they say, well, if it protects something other than a copyright, no protection, and it doesn't impinge on the limitations and exceptions. Here in Europe, you are in the midst of getting your own version of the broadcast flag. There's an organization called the DVB. They're a digital television standard specifying body, and they set the standards for digital television in Europe, Asia, Australia, and Latin America. And what's going on here is what we call policy laundering. So the studios went to America to get the broadcast flag, and they weren't going to get it. And so they came to Europe to get a super version of the broadcast flag so they could go back to America and argue for the need to harmonize with the European system. And so what they've been doing for the last several years is they've stacked the executive of the DVB forum with executives from American film companies. And they've set out to build something called the CPCM, the Content Protection Copy Management System, that's intended to form the basis of a regulatory mandate in every country that has digital television that comes under their standard, which is all the countries in Europe. And CPCM, I can't talk about many of the details because I'm bound by non-disclosure. I sit on this committee. Every few weeks I go to a different city in Europe and sit, and we have these long discussions about this. But I can tell you that it involves something called the authorized domain. And the authorized domain is the idea that they will restrict media to only those to only being used on those devices that are within one household, which means that the studios are basically defining what a household is. Right? So not only are they bootstrapping their monopoly on copying into devices, but also into social policy. They're also setting out limits on how often you can watch something once you've recorded it, whether you can record it at all, whether you can fast forward it, how long it will last on your recorder after it's been recorded, and so on and so forth. They've released something called the USI at a conference a little while ago. If any of you are interested, I'll send you a copy of it. That's been publicly disclosed now, and it goes into a lot of the detail on this. And they're setting out to do more. One thing that they've done along with all the other DRM consortia is they've said that open source and free software are not lawful in connection with their technology. So you're about to get a series of mandates across Europe that say that anything that can be used in connection with digital television applications, including video cards and hard drives, can't be implemented in free software, can't have free software drivers, and have to be designed to resist the creation of free software drivers. So we've been at WIPO now for 2 years, EFF, with a large coalition of NGOs, and we finally started to make some headway. Last year, we passed something called the Development Agenda through Brazil, Argentina, and India. This is an agenda that says that WIPO henceforth will make all of its treaties in a way that respects and promotes development and creativity. Now we're writing a treaty called the Access to Knowledge Treaty that sets out all the stuff that I've been talking about today. And we're having our next drafting meeting in a couple of weeks in London, actually, in a week from now in London. We've had one in Geneva. There's a mailing list that you can all join to follow along because it's taking place totally in public. For the first time, there's a WIPO treaty taking place in public. And the Norwegian envoy to WIPO could be a critical assistant in this. So this is something that your government can help make a reality internationally. So you've all sat very patiently, and I'm sorry that I couldn't give you this talk in Norwegian. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cory. One of the rules of Polytechnic Society meetings is that we are polite to you while you speak, and then you have to answer the hard questions afterwards.
Sure.
So I'll open the floor. I think you may be interested to know that there are people here that you talked about. Nick?
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for an interesting and both entertaining and wise intervention.
Thank you.
There are, of course, many footnotes one would like to put to your explanation of copyright. For instance, that at the time of Charles Dickens there were no international copyright at all, but that was devised by his colleague across the water, so across the channel, Victor Hugo, who also was as upset as Charles Dickens for not earning by the sales in England, and set about creating exactly the convention you mentioned, the Berne Convention, which the United States failed to adopt until after more than 100 years passed. And that was probably not because of their concern with American poetry or fiction, but with information technology and related works. And there are other footnotes like moral rights. Of course, if you read too much French, you may get sort of scared by them. But in this part of the world, we believe as much in them as the United States, which also is bound by it through the Berne Convention, which they have adopted. But my main point of taking the floor is two. One is when you enumerated those points which we should look to in adopting not only the WIPO Copyright Treaty, but also the European Directive. I wanted to just confirm that all those points are taken care of in the current proposal before the Parliament.
I don't know how many of them are. A lot of them have been suggested by the Geist Clinic and other people.
No, they are in the government's bill. So
I'm not sure how many of them were, and some of them are from
all of them, at least those you enumerated. If you do not look at the broadcast flag, because that is addressed in that proposal, but exception for archives, exception for blind, and so on.
Oh, in this government's bill?
Yeah, this.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Sorry, the Norwegian government. Sorry.
Oh, I thought you meant the Canadian Parliament.
Oh no. But there has of course been contact exactly on that respect. And also very pleased that you mentioned the solution of collective license. And as you may know, the Nordic countries has a special version of the collective license known as the extended statutory license, which make it possible if you have a representative organization of right holders, like authors, and you contract with this organization, the statute then expands the license to be global. And in this way you can solve things like exactly perhaps peer-to-peer network, though that hasn't been tried in detail, so it still is a suggestion rather than a plan. And it has been in this proposal before the Norwegian government now been suggested to be adopted for intra-networks, which is at least one step, that you may, through negotiation with an organization, get a license which allow you to put any material on your intranet. So I just wanted to mention that, and also to as I said, thank you for the address, and also for your contribution towards living and critical policy debate, which is so necessary.
Thank you. So one thing that we've been talking about a lot lately at EFF is kind of how any of the stuff that's been proposed will actually solve the problem of peer-to-peer. You know, usually in security analysis, in good security analysis, whenever anyone proposes a solution, you actually have to ask, well, what problem is it trying to solve, and does it solve it? You know, if we want to stop people from hijacking airplanes, how does making people take off their shoes solve that? Right, well, maybe reinforcing cockpit doors solves that problem. But making people take off their shoes or taking away people's nail scissors probably doesn't. Otherwise, it's not good security. Right? So when we have the idea that we're going to solve peer-to-peer with things like suing record industry customers or adding DRM, it's not clear how we get from that to the solution to peer-to-peer. You know, there's a great episode. Do you guys have South Park in this country? Cartoon show? So there's a great episode of South Park called the Magic Underpants Gnomes episode. And in the Magic Underpants Gnomes episode, there's a character who discovers that his underwear is being stolen. And he follows, by gnomes, and he follows the gnomes to their underground lair, where they have a huge mountain of underwear. And they have a sign over it, plan for world domination. Step 1, collect underwear. Step 2, it's blank. Step 3, profit. Right? And the whole episode revolves around him getting the gnomes to see that they're missing step 2. So, as near as I can tell, the recording industry, the film industry, seem to be in a position where it's like, step 1, sue everyone who used to buy records for downloading music, take everyone who still buys records and lock them up with DRM that makes the music that they can download more attractive. Step 2, something. Step 3, a chastened world returns to the shopping mall. Right? I don't know what step 2 is. Any other questions?
Regarding the language, you said you couldn't speak in Norwegian. You see, we use strong encryption in this country. Thanks for a very, very interesting talk. You made many very good points. I have one question I'd like to ask you. I know you have a certain affinity for Disney, and you write about Disney in many of your books. Do you think we have entered a period of eternal copyright? Because every time Mickey's about to expire, they lobby enough congressmen to lengthen or to harmonize, as you said, the times. That's a question I'll pose to you, and I'll give you 30 seconds to think about that. I'd just like to make a comment to Jon Bing. You said that this was taken care of in the Norwegian proposal. And you referred, I assume, to, for example, if you want to make a braille copy of something, you can go to a committee. There is a provision for that. You can go to a committee and ask them to bend the publisher, to open up the DRM. I do think there's a failing in that system, though, because maybe the publisher isn't there anymore. Maybe he's long gone by the time you want to make the braille. And since it's forbidden in the Norwegian proposal to sell or market tools to break DRMs, you might find yourself unable to make that braille, because you simply don't have the tools available and the publisher is gone.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, DRM is supposed to be a self-help measure, right? You're supposed to be able to help yourself to prevent people from infringing your copyright. Why shouldn't exercisers of limitations and exceptions also be able to help themselves to remove DRM in pursuit of lawful and legitimate limitations and exceptions? You know, there are many ad hoc, small organizations involved in doing beneficial work like transcoding books to Braille, archiving works, and so on. An archivist isn't a librarian. An archivist is someone with a hard drive full of stuff, right? The barrier to entry to being an archivist has fallen through the floor. The barrier to entry for transcoding books to Braille, fallen through the floor. And so if you're going to get involved in those technologies, you might just be one person at a computer, right? That's how the Gutenberg project was created, by one person at a computer. I have a pal in Scotland whose wife is responsible for preserving about 50 16th century books that she has scanned and OCR'd and contributed to Gutenberg. That's one person. She's not in any position to petition the government or a publisher for the tools or the right to pursue the limitations and exceptions she's granted under copyright. Now about Disney, I'll point out that actually Disney doesn't renew the copyright every time Mickey Mouse is about to expire. It's unfortunate that people believe it, because it's not even that important, because there are people, I think, who might reasonably say, well, Mickey Mouse, do you really want strippers dancing in Mickey Mouse ears? But Mickey Mouse is a trademark. He'll never expire. What Disney is actually extending copyright again and again and again for is for the first Mickey Mouse cartoon. It's not for Mickey Mouse, who will be owned in perpetuity for so long as he is associated with Disney in the public's mind. This is about protecting 3 minutes of 70-year-old animation. One of the things that I think, going back to this idea of good security analysis, what outcome do you hope to achieve, how does this achieve it? The idea that a corporation needs 90 years of copyright on its works in order to be assured of enough return on its investment to go on investing is belied by the market. Many of us are in business, or have been. I've started and sold a business. We're in a business school. There isn't a corporation in the world with a 90-year business plan. If you went to Bill Gates and you said, I'll give you 50 years of copyright, how many fewer lines of code will you commission from your programmers? The answer would be 0. I bet you if you went to Bill Gates and you said, I'm going to give you 15 years of copyright, how many fewer lines of code will you commission from your programmers? The answer would still be 0. So if the objective is to see to it that there's enough incentive in the marketplace for people to go on creating, a 90-year term of copyright is nonsensical. There isn't a single corporation in the world with a 90-year business plan. And we can talk about whether individuals need life in 70 years and whether that'll change how many years that how many works they'll create. But one thing I can tell you is that, as with the recent copyright extensions, retrospectively extending someone's copyright won't get them to write more, right? Giving Hemingway another 20 years of copyright won't convince him to write more books, because he's dead, right? How do we know Hemingway had enough incentive to write his books? Because he wrote them, right? We don't need to give him more incentive to write those books. They're written. So certainly there's never any excuse to extend the copyright on works that have already been created. And in Europe, you're going through this thrash now over performances that are about to enter the public domain after 50 years, Elvis and so on. This is, clearly we know that the corporations that commissioned and arranged for those performances had sufficient motivation to commission and arrange for those performances because they commissioned and arranged for those performances. Giving them more years won't get them to commission and arrange more performances from those artists. Now, it may be that for future works, we may decide, now that we know more about the market and the longevity of some works as compared to others, that we want to give them more years. But certainly, we don't need to give them more years on the stuff that's already been made. I think you wanted to rebut the point on tools.
Thank you. I won't pursue this, but the system, if we take Braille as an example, without making it too long, the system proposed is that first, the person who wants to make the Braille copy may circumvent himself or herself the protection. If that doesn't go, it doesn't work, that person may appeal to the producer and ask for help to circumvent their protection. If the producer won't, he may apply to a tribunal and ask for the tribunal to order the producer to do this. If the producer still won't do it, the tribunal may authorize circumvention annual.
But even if they authorize, if you're not allowed to buy the tools.
Yeah, but they authorize it, you are allowed to buy it.
But who's allowed to sell it to you?
Yep. With the authorizations, what you of course are quite correct in is that there will not be a very large marketplace for such tools. So that is quite true.
So,
but nevertheless, within the ramifications of the international instruments, this is going rather far, I suppose.
So, but an individual who wants to make a circumvention, who wants to make a use that requires a circumvention, has to have the wherewithal to hire attorneys to go to tribunal ultimately. Ultimately, to go to tribunal. Well, okay, so if you're a publisher and you just don't want to ever produce the work, you just throw away all the mail that you ever get from this person, right? Let's look at a little attack and defense, right? So you're a publisher, you threw away all the circumvention mail that you ever receive. It all goes in the bin. The person wants to take you to a tribunal. Now they not only need to have a computer and a scanner, they need a lawyer. Then having won their case in the tribunal, because again, you threw away the letter that told you to go to the tribunal too, right? Having won their case in the tribunal, then they have to hire a programmer to write original software from the ground up. A programmer who can't rely on any art that's in the field, because any other art that would be in the field, libraries, recyclable tools, even books that describe the techniques that he might or she might use, are themselves circumvention devices and unlawful. So you have to hire a lawyer, you have to hire a programmer to invent a new form of computer science, and then implement your circumvention device, and then you can't tell anyone how you did it. So that the next person who comes along has to do the same thing.
They actually have an exception also for textbooks on
okay. Well, for textbooks that contain source code for implementing a circumvention device?
No, but there's no reason to go into the nitty-gritty details, because the general point is made by yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that just seems, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a Byrne appendix on compulsory licenses for the developing world that lets you make translations of books if you're in the developing world without permission from the author. But the process is so cumbersome that no developing nation has ever used it successfully. And it strikes me that this is a traditional kind of shell game that major rights holders play when they're rewriting legislation or treaties, is they go, all right, we'll give you the exception, but we'll wrap it up in so much prerequisite that you'll never achieve it, right? We'll never have to worry about it being accomplished.
We'll see what the Canadian government.
Yeah, I think it's not clear. So all they've got is recommendations. They're doing the law now. It's not clear how far it'll go.
I think I'll cap just that discussion right there. I just referred to when the PGP software, or rather the peer-to-peer, what is it called? The PKI, the
Pretty good privacy.
PGP.
Yeah, not the. I was thinking of the mathematical formula underlying it was considered munitions, and we were not allowed to export it in a computer-readable format. So, a machine-readable format. So somebody made a T-shirt with a barcode of the formula, and they said it's not machine-readable; it is machine-washable.
I know someone who got our algorithm tattooed, and my colleague Seth Schoen wrote a haiku that expresses DCSS. That's the illegal haiku.
Question from the back, Mark Reed.
So I'm curious, what's happening in terms of the level of interception of email that's taking place, particularly into the United States at this point? I've noticed that my email, if I put certain keywords in the subject line or in the text somewhere, it seems to take sometimes as much as 5-6 hours to get to the other side.
That's shocking. I've never heard that. I know that there's...
I tried to run some tests, and I haven't quite been able to prove it, but I was wondering if you've heard anything like that. In other words, if the Patriot Act is sort of expanded to the point where they're setting up borders like that.
Well, there is a lot of... There are some widespread law enforcement tools that we know about, like Carnivore and so on, that read very large bodies of email, sometimes at network interchange points, and search for text patterns. I don't know that there... I use all kinds of strange language in my emails, and I've never noticed additional lags because I write about terrorism with my colleagues, and this is the problem of the spam fight too, right? I mean, anyone who actually has a legitimate need to talk about Viagra will never get their email delivered. Doctor, I took so much Viagra and I think I'm going to die. That email will, I guarantee you, that email will not be delivered. People who research email worms. And, hey, Fred, I just found this new email worm in my mailbox. Let me send it to you. That email will never be delivered. The illegal words on the internet. Thanks. But I've never noticed any real lag on that stuff. My suspicion is that if they're doing this stuff, they're post-processing it, that they're not trying to process it in real time. And so, I mean, when you look at the stuff that they do at university campuses where they have wide-scale wiretapping, they just copy every packet as it runs through the router. and then later on they do some kind of post-processing on it, but they don't try to process it in real time, specifically because of those giant delays, you know. So I don't know anything about that, sorry.
You don't know any systematic pattern on that?
No, I mean, certainly we haven't heard anything. EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, would be a good group to ask.
Further questions? Yes? Please state your name.
Sorry, my name is Shaq Reynolds, and I'm just sort of interested to have you maybe speak a little bit more about the Creative Commons movement and Lawrence Lessig, and the fact that there is sort of another sort of idealistic alternative here, which is choose not to participate.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm just wondering what your opinion is.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, I use Creative Commons licenses on my work. Creative Commons is a project that was started by Lawrence Lessig, who's on EFF's board, and tonight I'm dressed like him. I just realized as I was coming home, I'm wearing a suit jacket, a black t-shirt, and a pair of blue jeans. I'm wearing Larry's clothes. The idea of a Creative Commons license is to remove the lawyers from the process of sharing works and collaborating with other people. Because today, if you want to collaborate with other people, you need to hire a lawyer to set up the terms under which you're going to collaborate with them. If you want to let your song be used by someone else in a non-commercial project and not allow them to reuse it commercially, you need to write a license for that. And if that license is going to be good and binding, you need to hire a lawyer for it. And then they probably need to hire a lawyer to make sure that it says what you say it says, so that they can be sure that they're going to use it and not going to get sued by you. So that's a lot of lawyer hours. And the thing about the internet is it's dropped the cost of collaboration through the floor, but it hasn't dropped the cost of legal advice through the floor. And as a result, if you really wanted to dot all your I's and cross all your T's as you went about your daily business on the internet, you'd have to pay a fortune in legal fees. Right? You know, you have movies like the one that just went to Cannes, Tarnation, where this guy made a movie in his basement with a copy of iMovie for $200 that went to Cannes that cost $400,000 to clear the music for. Right? So the licensing side of this, right, the lawyer side of this has gone through the roof. So the idea of Creative Commons is to create a world where if you want to allow people to reuse your work, and you don't want to hire lawyers, you don't want them to have to hire lawyers, and you want to just give them the assurance that they can use it in plain language, then you can go and choose a Creative Commons license. There are Creative Commons projects underway in 81 countries to localize the language, localize the law and language of these licenses. There are over 10 million works licensed under Creative Commons. And Creative Commons licenses have a human-readable summary that's intended for a lay audience like you and me. I'm not a lawyer. They have a machine-readable summary that's intended for search engines, so that you can go to a search engine like Yahoo and you can say, find me Creative Commons licensed screenplays I can license for my student film. And it will turn them up. And they have a lawyer-readable license that is legally sufficient. Student films are a really good example of why this stuff is really necessary. It used to be that students who were making student films didn't worry about copyright because the act of making a student film never involved an act of public distribution or public performance that any rights holder was likely to get hold of. So if you made a student film and you screened it in the student union or you screened it in your student class, you didn't need to worry about it. But today, a student film lives on the internet and it is subject to the same rules that are applied to $200 million studio films. That's a really tough bar to hurdle if you're a student, right? The bars that are in place for $200 million studio films assume a whole lot of infrastructure, an army of lawyers, a completion guarantor, right? People who are experienced in these matters, a budget. Right? Student films don't have any of that stuff. And so we need a new set of rules to accommodate them now that they're on the internet. You know, if you read law review articles about copyright on the internet, one of the examples that always crops up, it's kind of the ultimate hoary cliche of a law review article about the internet, is this law review article, if you're reading it over the internet, involves making several copies. Why, there's the copy on the hard drive that it's served from, and the copy in the frame in the network buffer, and then the copy at the router, and then the copy at the other side in the network buffer, and then the copy on the hard drive, and then the copy that's in the frame buffer for the monitor, and the copy that's on the screen. And you know, how many of these copies need licenses, if any of them, as you read the article? Look at this. What a strange and funny world we've entered. Well, it's technically true that all of those things are copies, and in a lot of places, many of those copies are classed as ephemeral and just taken out of the licensing world. But really what I think everyone who's sensible, who looks at that, which it lets out a lot of lawyers, unfortunately, is they look at that and they say, this is copying, technically speaking, but what this really is reading. And the idea that you need a license to read is nuts. Now, how many of these activities should require licenses? None of them. None of them. The license that you get is the license to read, right? That's passing through the conditional access system. It's being authorized to get the page. But all those copies, the idea that you need a license depending, every time you make a backup, what if your browser caches on your backup? Do you need to get another license? It's crazy. The internet would collapse under the weight of the lawyers if we tried to do this. So this is what Creative Commons tries to solve. It tries to inject some kind of moderate position. A moderate position that says some copies aren't copies even though they look like copies. If you're deaf and you have a cochlear implant, every song you hear, you make a copy of. Right? Do you need to get a mechanical license for every song you hear? What if it's just a car passing by and you only hear a few bars? Who do you pay the license fee to? Right? The sensible answer to that is, yeah, it's a copy, but it's not a copy. Right? Well, the sensible answer to this is, yeah, it's a copy, but it's not a copy either. Now, unfortunately, the law isn't getting there. So what we need are Creative Commons licenses, and this is something that everyone can do. If you have a blog, if you release works, you can release works under licenses that are very limited, that just say non-commercial reuse is okay, non-commercial republishing is okay, and we do that for all of our work on Boing Boing. It's a commercial for-profit entity, and we do that, and it works real well for us.
And EU has decided that it's not sure, and you have no one to hold accountable if it breaks, and it says that in the licenses. So all the lawyers do, the only work they do is that they can hold anybody accountable, and they can hold anybody accountable for their privacy or other security measure. And here you have the DRM, all the technology, that they decide by law to choose to use the systems that you can't hold accountable. But on the other side, the system that you can hold accountable to preserve privacy, to preserve DRM. This is not allowed. How do you explain this? Call it.
Well, so I don't think that proprietary or open DRM actually stops copying. So I don't think that there is really an accountability question there, because I think that anyone who's honest will say that. I mean, even when you talk to DRM advocates, they all say, well, this is only intended to be proof against a skilled attacker who's a non-skilled attacker who's not determined. But a skilled attacker, of course, will go through this like Superman through wet Kleenex. But and they say, but most people aren't skilled attackers. And of course, the answer to that is, yeah, most people aren't skilled attackers, but the first person has a hard time making a copy, right? All subsequent users have an easy time making a copy because they make a copy of the copy the first guy made. So DRM doesn't work at all. As to crypto and personal privacy, see, I don't know about that. I'm torn. I don't think EFF has a policy on this because I don't think that's been really floated much in the U.S. But my feeling is that given that crypto is necessarily broken eventually, that the actual life cycle of crypto is, here's a means that we believe is secure, here's some peer review of it, go ahead and use it now. Ongoing peer review finds some problems in it. Please stop using that system and use this new one. Well, I think that given that that's the only way that we know of to do good security, how can you hold people accountable for when their security fails? I mean, the thing is that you're supposed to disclose how your security works, get the best security you can, and when your security fails, you're supposed to improve it. But I don't know, I would worry that there would be a boomerang effect if you held people accountable for crypto. Like implementation failures after they've disclosed and found all the flaws that they could, if there were still implementation failures that no one could see, wouldn't the boomerang effect of that be that no one would want to disclose how anything worked and would want to hush up any leaks that they had, as opposed to telling everyone, oh, we had a crack on this system, everyone should patch it now? Whereas, if you had this rule, maybe when you had a crack on the system, you'd never tell anyone because you'd be worried that all your users whose data had been compromised through the crack would come after you. I'm not sure. It's a tough issue. I mean, obviously, putting liability on people who are responsible for making the systems, as opposed to the people whose data is stored in them, that's it's preferable. But maybe what we do for the safeguard of that liability is require disclosure, which doesn't necessarily mean free software, but it does mean that you have to tell people how it works.
And with that, I think we should end the session. Cory, on behalf of the Polytechnic Society, we would very much like to thank you. And also to you. This is one of those non-negotiable, non-renegable deals. You are hereby a member of the
Can't waive my regular membership.
cannot. This is also a book about Norway with a CD. I am sure you know what to do with. And I already gave you a backpack, which every Norwegian needs. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now there are some refreshments served outside. There is champagne, there is red wine, there is some mineral water, and I'm sure we'll continue the discussion outside. Thank you.